Hello everyone, it's Paul Nixon and I'm delighted to be presenting to you again. Today it's talk of the Victorian soldier, a subject close to my heart, and I have two Victorian ancestors who were fought in the army or served in the British Army. My great-grandfather on my mother's side was a Crimean soldier, a senior soldier at that, and he also served with the Queen's West Surrey Regiment. And my great-grandmother's brother on my father's side was also a career soldier who served in the Hussars, or in the 10th Hussars, also later in the Rifle Brigade and the Royal Defence Corps. So I have heritage, British Army heritage. Another ancestor, I think a great-grandfather, served with the Norfolk Regiment, then the 9th Foot, and was in Meerut in India when his daughter, my great-grandmother, was born. So a lot of history that I have, and I'm just going to now take you through some slides which I've put together to talk about the Victorian soldier. Of necessity, it's a whisk through to some degree. It covers such a wide period that it's impossible to give any great detail, but hopefully what I'm going to share will be of interest. There will be there's bibliography at the end, which I recommend you have your finger poised over the print screen button for, and we'll come to that later on. So let's kick off then. So what we'll be looking at today is the recruitment process in the British Army during the Victoria's reign. So she reigned from 1837 to 1901. We'll look at army forms, we'll look at the health of the army, the composition of the army, really, the regular army, the Army of India, often overlooked, but it was a significant force for Britain, the militia, the volunteers, and then there's a couple of slides on identifying uniforms. Some of you will have seen these before if you've seen my photo detective slides, but it's still worth pointing out now. And that photo montage on the right, photos from my collection, which are just spread out there. These mostly show Victorian soldiers. So looking at the army as a whole, if we go back pre-Victorian era, back to 1809, you've got close to 700,000 men serving in some capacity in the armed forces, which includes the regulars, the militia, local militia and volunteers. So this is at the height of Napoleonic wars. So there's the Peninsular Wars have happened. Waterloo is a few years ahead. There's scares, worries about invasion from the French onto Britain's shores. And so you have a highly alert and organised army. By 1821, the Napoleon threat is over, just 101,000 men left under arms. And then in 1837, Queen Victoria ascends the throne. So by 1854, you've got 140,000 full-time soldiers, 71,000 at home, and then 29,000 in India, 40,000 in the colonies. And then a couple of years later, of course, you have the Crimea War, you have the mutiny in India, and then the increase in the army generally. So by 1893, you've got 224,000 full-time soldiers, comprised of 116,000 at home, 35,000 in the colonies, and 73,000 in India. So you can see the difference there between the numbers in India, and that's explained by after the mutiny, and we'll come to this slide later on. The Army of India, the Honourable East India Company, handed over control to Britain, and it was the British Army rather than the Honourable East India Company's army, which was populating in India. Now, newspapers that you can access through Findmypast or the British Newspaper Archive give tremendous facts about the army, and I forget what the search term was that I keyed in here. It might have been army establishment or British Army, probably army establishment, because you've got those keywords there, army establishment on the third line. And the army establishment was fixed each year, and so you had the numbers of men who were going to be at home and in the colonies in India. So this extracts from 1893. You got straight away there the number. The Secretary for War proposed that 224,000 men of all ranks would be the establishment, and then you've got the breakdown. You've got the breakdown by arms. So you've got the cavalry, the artillery, the engineers, Army Service Corps, and infantry. But it gives you the total for each location. So you've got here at home 116,000 in Britain and Ireland, that is, In the colonies in Egypt, you've got 35,000, and then in India, you've got 73,000. So, I mean, if you wanted to do so, you could go through the newspapers year after year after year and see how those figures are increasing. Just interesting here, as I say, you've got 224,258. That excludes militia and volunteers, and that's in 1893. Now in Britain, British Army today is 110,000, which includes part-time soldiers, 30,000 reserves. So you can see the drastic change in fortunes, or certainly in numbers anyway, over the last couple of 100 years in the British Army. Most of the men come starving. This was somebody who'd, well, it was not somebody, it was a general who reported this at the Wantage Committee in 1880. And it was his statement about the men joining the army, the recruits joining the army. Most of the men come starving. And soldiering was poorly paid, but it did offer an escape from poverty. I mean, the rate of pay barely changed for the private soldier over the years. It was £1 a day. And out of that, they had stoppages for damages and damages to barracks and necessaries, they called it. But when work was thin on the ground, or if there were strikes called and men were not able to work, the prospect of regular pay and a roof over your head was not unattractive. And a lot of impoverished men out of work did join the army. Periods of enlistment evolved over the years. So up to 1847, recruits would be enlisted for 21 years. And from 1847, they enlisted for 10 years with the option to re-engage for further terms if they wanted to do so. In 1870, the Enlistment Act, brought in by Edward Cardwell, stated 12 years service, which was a combination of colour service and reserve service. So by that, I mean, colour service would be service with the regiment, wearing the uniform in whatever location you happen to be, and reserve service was out of the army, back in civilian life, to all intents and purposes a civilian, but still being paid by the army to be on the reserve and still liable to be called out if the country needed you to come out and serve, as happened in the Boer War in 1899, and as happened, of course, in the First World War in 1914. Here's another comment from that same committee, the Army Organisation Committee in 1880. The men we value do not enlist. So I'll go to the second quote here first. This employer was saying, men who spend too much of their money on drink and waste their time in dissipation frequently as a last resort go into the army. The men we value do not enlist. And that's the problem with the British Army. It's Kipling's poem, it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and call on the soldier when you need him, but if he wants to go into the music hall or into a bar, then it's a different story. Soldiers were poorly regarded, except when they were fighting for Queen and country. And this other quote that I've used at the top here is from a man who had enlisted in the volunteer force and then was saying to his father that he was going to enlist in the regular army. And the comment was, this is what he said: "Never have I seen a man so infuriated. To him, my enlistment was a blow from which he thought he would never recover, for it meant a disgrace of the worst type, his son a soldier." And I've seen quotes like that in many pieces of literature. It just was not deemed to be an honourable profession. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the service records that we have on Findmypast, you'll see lots of incidents of men who are called up for drunkenness or fighting or insubordinate language or whatever, but I mean, the fact of the matter is that there were 1,000,001 crimes for which you could go into the defaulter's book, but the soldiers proved themselves time and time again in battle and overseas, and the army certainly had a good way of transforming a civilian into a soldier through a very rigorous routine. So if you wanted to join the army, a recruiting sergeant would hand the intending recruit a form telling him where to report. So that you'd have recruiting offices throughout the country. There used to be a very large one, St George's in Trafalgar Square, which is pretty much where the National Gallery is now, just around the corner from that. There was a very big recruiting centre there. So the recruit would then take his report and would be medically inspected, and if he passed the medical inspection, he took the oath. Before he was finally accepted, that enlistment was approved by a superior officer. And again, you see that on the attestation paper. It might be an idea at some point for me to actually number on one of these papers the order in which the approval process went, because if you look at any attestation paper, you'll see at the top the number written in the regiment. Well, that was not the first thing that went on there. The man would first of all sign to say that he'd answered all the questions, he understood all the questions. Then it was the approval process, and then when he finally presented himself to the regimental depot, whichever regiment he was at, that's when the number would have been written onto that form. So as an example, in 1897, 77,648 men were handed a form by a recruiting sergeant, but of those, close to 26,000 were rejected before attestation, and 13,000 failed to present themselves, and 22 rejected for other reasons. So that's 50%, just over 50% failure rate straight away of those 78,000 men nearly. And then further to that, another 4,200 were rejected by various authorities. Some deserted, and others were found to be non-effective for other reasons. So again, it brings it right down. So of those 77,648 men, you have only 33,700 who were finally found fit and enlisted. A man's service began at the age of 18, but boys could also be enlisted as well. Each regiment also enlisted a number of boys. Often the boys were the sons of senior serving officers, senior non-commissioned officers, that is, so warrant officers, colour sergeants, sergeant majors, etc. And there was a limited number of roles for boys, or places for boys, but boys would be enlisted for 12 years. There was no obligation for or no option for reserve service for a boy. You enlisted for a straight 12 years with the colours, and the boys generally went into the band where they learnt the trade. They learnt to play the drums, or they learnt to play the bugle, and they became bandsmen later on. So here's another couple of extracts from the British Newspaper Archive, which is full of fascinating articles on Queen Victoria's Army. So in this one, you've got army recruiting in the Midlands. So if you're interested in who was joining in the Midlands and the regional splits, it gives you the figures there. So you've got the official returns of army recruiting showing the number of people joining up at Warwick, etc. It doesn't tell you all the regiments, but it says of the 1,200 who joined at Warwick, 373 were for the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. So you might think that's quite a small number, really, given that the regiments at this time of history were organised on a county basis. So you would think that anyone in Warwickshire wanting to join the army in the infantry would join the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, but that of course was not the case. Men could join other regiments, they could choose to join other regiments. For that matter, regiments recruited outside of their traditional recruiting areas, and particularly those regiments which were spread over a wide area or had thin populations. So I'm thinking of the Border Regiment, and I'm thinking of 1903. I know it's outside the Victorian era, but I did some research on this some while ago. I'm looking at Border Regiment recruits in 1903, and you'd be surprised the number of men who joined from Stratford or East London joined the Border Regiment, and that would have been because there was a recruiting drive in that area, and men signed up for the Border Regiment. So that's interesting. And then the second extract here is from the Dundee Courier from 1899. More than half the infantry recruits of the British Army for the past year have been under the 18 years of age, which is unusual. You'll find that, as I say, boys could join, but the majority of men who joined the army were between 18 and 21. It was a young man's, still is a young man's job, of course, a young man's career. But interesting facts from the Dundee Courier there. So typical service in the infantry during the Victorian era, most of the Victorian era anyway, was for an infantryman would enlist for 7 years with the colours and 5 years on the reserve. Now, the first 3 months would be spent at the regimental depot. Then the man was posted to the home battalion to complete his training. So the first 3 months, it's intense training really at the regimental depot. The man learns the learns the ropes. There's a combination of drill, gymnastic exercise, musketry exercise, etc. Also learning regimental history. Then after that 3 months, he's posted to the home battalion, because, as I say, most regiments had 2 battalions. One was at home and one was overseas, and those battalions would rotate. So let's say the 1st Battalion of the Essex Regiment, for argument's sake, might be the home battalion, might be stationed not necessarily in Essex, could be anywhere in the United Kingdom and Channel Islands, and the 2nd Battalion would be overseas. And then that battalion, after a period of time overseas, would come back to the UK, and the 1st Battalion would go overseas. So they would swap. And so when a man joins the army, he was given a number, and that regimental number stayed with him, and it wouldn't have changed the fact that he went from one battalion, from the 1st to the 2nd, or from the depot to the 1st, etc. He kept that number with him the whole time. It didn't change. But anyway, he completed his training at the home battalion in the United Kingdom in those first 12 to 18 months, and then he would be posted to the overseas battalion. And it's worth pointing out now, although again it's not Victorian era, it's First World War. But when when Britain went to war in 1914, it was those men who were serving in the UK battalions, the less trained men, who formed the bulk of the expeditionary force. Those men who'd probably got between 12 and 18 months service, who were in the UK and who, under the normal course of events, would have gone overseas. They were the men who were at home, who were sent out to face the German army, along with reservists, of course, while the older, more better trained men came later to the Western Front, because they were in places like India and Egypt. And that's why you see these 2 divisions, the 28th and the 29th Division in the First World War. They were regular divisions, but they weren't composed as regular divisions, full regular divisions, until some while later, because the men had all come from overseas, and they were replaced overseas by territorial force units often. So I mean, that's sort of digressing a little bit here, but it's just showing you the pattern. So generally the older men, the better trained men, were the ones who were overseas, because they'd done their stint in the UK, they'd done their stint at the depot, they'd done their stint with the home battalion, and now it was the time for them to go overseas and serve in India, and mostly India, but it could be other stations as well. It could be Canada, it could be the West Indies, it could be Egypt, and that would have been part of the selling point to these men. So the picture there on this slide is men outside St George's Square in Trafalgar Square. That's part of the thrill of the army. It's join the army, see the world. That message has barely changed over the years. So they would serve overseas with the overseas battalion, and then after a period of time, they would come back to the UK, and then would be transferred to the Army Reserve, where they would be paid 6pence a day as a reservist. And that money was not paid. It was paid in quarterly instalments of 4pence a day, equivalent to 4pence a day. So you get your quarterly payment equivalent to that amount, and then at the end of the year, provided you'd attended all the necessary drills, which you had to attend as a reservist, you would be paid the balance. And some men would have kept that by for a rainy day. A lot of men, like Frank Richards, who wrote Old Soldier Saab and Old Soldiers Never Die, used it to have a jolly good drink up with his friends. But anyway, that's what they were paid. They were paid, say, £1 a day for a soldier, 6pence a day, so it's half the rate for a reservist. But men could extend their period of colour service if they wanted to, and they could re-engage to complete 21 years service with the army. And if they did, then they got a pension as well. So here's the top of an attestation form, and you'll see those of you who are familiar with these papers from Findmypast will have often seen, or might have thought, what's that wording on there? You see duplicate on some, you see original on others, and that's because when a man attested, the form was filled in twice. It wasn't photocopied. There were no photocopies, of course, but it was completed in duplicate, and those forms followed a man throughout his career. So in this case, this is a duplicate attestation form. This is the second form to be completed, but with all his details. It's Alfred Nixon, who's no relation, but and you can see that he signed up for 7 years with the colours. Note the spelling of colours, and 5 years in the reserve. And here's another form from a bit later. This man, in this case, signed up for 3 years with the colours and 9 years in the reserve, because the period of service did change over the years. The army was constantly looking at increasing the reserve of men, and that's what happened in 1903 when this period of service was brought in, again post Victoria's reign, but I use this as an example. 3 years with the colours and 9 years in the reserve. And the beauty of this of these records in W97 is that they're colour. So you see the same papers in 363 and W363 and W364 for the First World War, but they're all photocopies, of course. They're microfilmed, not photocopies, microfilmed. So it's just black and white. But here you have the detail in colour. And I've highlighted this box here because I want to talk about this little section in the next slide. I'd originally titled this slide for nerds only, but I find this quite fascinating, really. So it's looking at the Army attestation papers and the information at the top. So here you've got F&T, which is the name of the printers. That's Ford and Tilt, who were the printers. And it's telling you that there was a print run of 120,000 in March 1889, which is why you've got 389. I'm not sure what the numbers underneath that are, 850, 847. They appear on other documents as well. But the figure to the right shows you that it's Army Form B265, and this print run of 120,000 in March 1889 was the 22nd iteration, the 22nd print run of this particular form. Now, that might have been some of those print runs might have just been reprinting the previous version, but quite often the text was changed. So, for instance, when Queen Victoria died in 1901 and her son King Edward became Edward VII, then the forms all had to change because it had to say, I'm happy to join His Majesty's Army rather than Her Majesty's Army. And you will see, in fact, if you look at some of those attestation papers in 1901, at around the time Victoria died, just after, when they hadn't had time to reprint the forms, you'll have seen that whoever was filling out the form had to go through every line and cross out her and replace it with his and she with he. So it was a real task for the scribes at the time. So similarly, on this second example I'm showing you here, this is HWV is Hazel Watson and Viney Limited. They acquired Ford and Tilt printers in 1884, and this is again a print run of 100,000 forms in May 1903. So, and that was the 31st iteration of that particular form. And for those of you who really are interested in such matters as I am, you can go to my blog, Army Forms and Attestations, .blogspot.com, which has lots of examples of forms. I haven't really kept that blog up, but you will find examples of forms there and some narrative as well, which might be helpful or just interesting. So here's an example of terms from the forms, really, which show you how they can change, and I can explain this a little bit as well. So as I said earlier, the colour service and reserve service, 12 years in total, 7 years on the in the army and 5 years on the reserve. But it says there, if at the termination of such period of army service you're serving beyond the seas, then the first 8 years in army service and the remaining 4 years. So if you're overseas and you're coming close to the end of your 7 years, you couldn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to get back dead on the dot of 7 years. You'd probably have to wait for the next troop ship. So that's why that clause is in there. And the men in India were sent to a place called Dulali. I've mentioned this on the last talk I gave, I think. And it was, and that's where the expression, Dulali, a little mad, comes from, because the men would be there. They'd be waiting impatiently to get back, going crazy, waiting for the troop ship to come and take them home. So that was at Dulali, spelled Deolali, D-W-E-O-L-A-L-I. And then on the other form example I've given there, you've got this. This is the shorter service. This is 3 years with the colours and 9 years on the reserve. And it says here, it doesn't give a specific time. It just says you'll be sent home with all convenient speed. And really, that whole enlistment term of 3 and 9 didn't work well for the army in India, because no sooner had you been sent out there than you'd be back again. You'd almost be back, turned around on the troop ship coming back. So it was short-lived. By 1907, that particular form of attestation had been thrown out of the window, but for the infantry anyway. But it still did exist in some other arms of the services. Again, just some examples here from Army Form B267A, and I have written a post on this particular form on my blog, which is where I've taken these headers from. So this again gives you just a flavour of the different types of forms. So this one is a long service. So short service is a combination of colour service and reserve service. Long service is just the full 12 years with the colours. So this is long service for cavalry of the line in 1900 for 12 years. The next one is a little bit later, 1904. So this is short service for the household cavalry. So you have cavalry of the line. So that's the dragoons, dragoon guards, hussars and lancers. And then you've got the household cavalry, which is the first Life Guards, second Life Guards, and Royal Horse Guards. So they're the household cavalry. For those men, you've got 8 years with the colours and 4 years in the reserve. And then same form underneath, but it's been adopted and adapted for cavalry of the line. And again, you will see this particularly on First World War papers, where men were rushing to join the colours and there just weren't the right number of forms available. You can see from what I've already mentioned about the different iterations of the forms, 31 versions of one form. As one form became obsolete, a new form replaced it. But obviously, when men were joining up in the First World War, there were still overstocks of some of these older forms. And that's why you see often men being signed up for full-time service on an attestation form that was to be used for the Special Reserve, or an attestation paper that was somewhat out of date. It could be years out of date. And again, somewhere on my in my really boring spreadsheets folder, I've got a spreadsheet which has detailed the different attestation forms and when they were being used. So earlier we looked at figures showing the number of men who signed up and the number who actually made it through, and the health of the army was not great. The quote earlier on about they come in poverty, they come from the lowest strata of society. In 1860, 48% of recruits were rejected as unfit for military service. It did improve, so 40 years later the figure had fallen to 33%, but it's still a lot. It's still a high figure. So by the turn of the century, a third of recruits are being rejected, and as you will see on papers on Findmypast, people could be rejected for all manner of reasons, but often it was bad teeth. Strangely enough. Now, here's an example of a medical form that you'll find in a medical history form that you'll find in W97. I find these very useful. This form and also the disciplinary forms, the conduct sheets, can be extremely useful if you're wanting to work out a location of a regiment, where a regiment was stationed over a particular period of time. Because here, on the left-hand side, you've got the station, the garrison, the barracks, etc., where the man is. Then you've got the date of arrival at the station, and then you've got date of admission to hospital as well. Then you've got the diseases and then the treatment, etc., etc. But it's that first section which can be very useful. And again, something I've done for my own interest really is to look at to try and work out where the regiments were at different times. There are, I have got documents that do give this, but not in as much detail. And there used to be a very good site called regiments.org, which I still have a cut of, which does show you some of the stations, but again, not in the detail, and some of the information is incorrect. But if you want to do this, this is what you do. So on Findmypast, the search is very flexible. So you can put that asterisk wildcard in, which I bang on about each talk I give because it is so useful and so essential. Use the wildcard. In this case, I was looking for men of the 2nd 9th Foot. So that's the 9th Regiment of Foot is now the Norfolk Regiment, or was the Norfolk Regiment from 1881, and the 2 means it's the 2nd Battalion. And just by using this man's hospital admissions sheet, his medical history form, I'd made a note of where he was. So on the 2nd of November 1878, he was at Nowshera in India. Then he was at Peshawar. He was admitted to hospital there on different times. So that's why you have multiple entries for the 19th, 2nd, and 15th. But it's basically it's a timestamp and a place stamp. So it's saying, okay, the regiment was here at this particular point in time. You have to you have to treat it with a degree of caution, because of course men wouldn't necessarily always be in the same location. Some men would be sent off on a signalling course here, other men would be sent off somewhere else. Maybe some of the battalion would be sent up into the hills, and another part of the battalion was sent somewhere else. So you have to use it with a bit of caution, but the more names you have, the bigger the database gets and the more patterns you can see. And so I've just used an example of one man here, and for 1819 Allen, he was with the 1st 9th Foot at Limerick in 1880. But for Archer, I've used all his locations to plot where the 2nd 9th Foot was. So he was in those locations. He served in Afghanistan. He was at Kabul in December 1879 and back in India. And as I say, if you do that for enough men, you pretty soon see a pattern, and you can build up a list of all the places a particular regiment served with over a number of years. I just put this in because I think it's quite interesting. I've seen this in a number of different books, and this particular extract is from E.J. Hardy, the Reverend E.J. Hardy, in a book called Mr. Thomas Atkins, and I laugh because on the spine of that book it says by the author of How to Stay Happy Though Married, which I think is a great title. But I've not read the book, but his point is about the vanity of the soldier, and you'll see plenty of pictures of soldiers out and about on the town carrying their swagger stick. And here you've got this man with his curls so neatly positioned, and it says there, the quote, "I would rather," said a soldier most solemnly, "lose an arm than have my front hair cut too short." And you'll see this in a lot of photos. Here's another good example as well. This is obviously earlier. So the Irregular Army, 1837 to 1881. There's a strict order of precedence in the army. So the artillery, the cavalry, the infantry, they're all the ex-Regiment of Foot. So the 1st Regiment of Foot would become the Royal Scots. The 2nd would become the Queen's Royal West Surrey. The 3rd would become the Buffs. The 4th would be King's Own, etc. So the first 25 regiments of foot each had two battalions. And in 1871, again, Edward Cardwell, the Regulation of the Forces Act sought to divide the country into brigade districts, later renamed regimental districts, and pair line infantry regiments with one another. In some instances, it worked very well. So in Essex, the two regiments that were put together were East Essex and West Essex. That's my county, but in other parts of the country, it was not the case. So this quote here is from Richard Tryman in a book called Regiments of the British Army, which I picked up in a second-hand bookshop in Charing Cross Road for a song. And he wrote, "Look at the 31st Huntingdonshire and the 70th Surrey linked together at Kingston. Is every Huntingdonshire man who wishes to join his regiment to walk all the way to Kingston to enlist, and when he does so, be uncertain whether he's to wear the Huntingdon buff or the Surrey black?" The whole thing was that each regiment had a proud tradition, and suddenly you had these regiments that had nothing in common being thrust together. Now, in July 1881, both those two regiments were retitled as the East Surrey Regiment, but of course the East Surreys had nothing, or East Surrey would have nothing to do with Huntingdonshire in Cambridge, and that was Richard Tryman's point. So for the regular army for 1881, the Cardwell reforms of 1881, July 1881, you suddenly see the regiments of foot no longer existing, and they've now become the East Surrey Regiment or the Essex Regiment. Most line infantry regiments have 2 regular battalions and a militia battalion. Some have more than one militia battalion, and some, for that matter, infantry regiments like the Rifle Brigade and King's Royal Rifle Corps, for instance, they have 4 regular battalions. But typically the 1st and 2nd battalions were the regular battalions, and the 3rd is the militia. As I mentioned earlier, one battalion would be the home battalion, and the other one would be the overseas battalion. And most soldiers would do a stint at home and overseas. And surviving records for these men appear in W97 and sometimes in W363 and 364. But be warned, the majority of records in W97 have been heavily weeded, and for the most part, it's only the attestation papers which survive, because those papers, as I said earlier, they followed a man throughout his career, so they were regularly updated with information such as promotions, if there were serious disorderly conduct, etc. If he was in a court martial, before a court martial, if he was court-martialed, that would appear on the form as well. You'd have the locations where he served. You'll have details of medals awarded, if he was wounded, details of wounds, details of courses attended, next of kin. So you had a lot of information on that particular form. Don't forget to check medal rolls as well, because the British Army was involved continuously. I think 1883 was the only year between about, I don't know, I can't remember offhand, but 1868 and 1902. 1883 was the only year when the army wasn't involved in some activity somewhere. If there wasn't a conflict like war in Afghanistan or in South Africa, there would be some disturbance up on the borders and the northwest frontier. So the army was continuously engaged, and you can check medal rolls. If you go to the National Archives now, for instance, you can download medal rolls. Go to Discovery, type in WO100, which is the medal roll series, and you'll find the medal rolls, and you can download those rolls free of charge. And they're well worth looking at. I recommend that. The point I haven't mentioned on here is for soldiers who died. Now, a soldier who died, his service record probably does not survive, because the Ministry of Pensions would have logically reasoned, well, if he's dead, he's not going to be claiming a pension, so let's get rid of his file. And so that's what happened. You do occasionally see files that survive, but for the most part they don't. So some of you will have seen this slide before, but it's still worth pointing out, so I will go through it. So this is a man from the Leinster Regiment, and the things to look at on this particular slide, on this particular photo, would be the pattern of the jacket, which would identify the time it would have been issued. The trouser pattern, you've got stripes on the engineers. The artillery had a thick red stripe down the side. This man, being infantry, would have had a thin red stripe. You've got cloth badges, in that case his good conduct chevron, collar badges, cap badges, accoutrements, so belts, etc. The photographer and the location, the colour of his uniform. In his case, he's wearing a red jacket with blue cuffs, blue trousers, and also don't forget to check the back of the photograph as well. So again, same man. So the pattern of the jacket tells you it's 1881 to 1902. He's got a thin stripe, good conduct chevron. So that good conduct chevron was at this particular point in time, it was awarded for 2 years service and then 6 years service. From 1905, that changed from 2 years service and 5 years service. So you can see that. So in this case, this man has been in the army for at least 2 years, but not as long as 6 years. So you've got the collar badges there, and his cap badge as well. Slade Wallace belt. Photographer and location again, the blue facings, which I've mentioned, and possibly, because this was taken at Hythe in Kent, he was possibly on a musketry course. So the Royal Regiments would have blue facings. So the man on the right is from a Royal Regiment, so that could be something like the Royal Sussex Regiment, for instance. So they wore blue facings, and the facings, as I say, is the collars and the cuffs. English and Welsh line regiments have mostly white facings. Scottish had yellow, Irish had green, and the Rifle Brigade wore green and black, and the King's Royal Rifle Corps wore green and scarlet. None of that helps any of us, does it, if it's all black and white? But anyway, that's what they wore. So there you have on the left, King's Royal Rifle Corps, in the middle, Lincolnshire, and on the far right, sporting a wonderful hairstyle, is a man from the Royal Sussex Regiment. So you can see there for those last two, he's got the blue. It's a slightly darker shade of grey, but it is blue. And the man in the centre has the white, very obviously white. And those cuffs are what they call jam pot cuffs, and that distinguishes him straight away as a soldier from that particular period of time. Again, another photo. In this case, the photo I have, it said men from the Shropshire Regiment, or it would be the King's Shropshire Light Infantry aboard a troop ship. But in fact, as again I've illustrated on a previous talk, there's men from different regiments. So you've got the Rifle Brigade, you've got the King's Shropshire Light Infantry, you've got the Northumberland Fusiliers, and you've got the East Lancashire Regiment as well in those photos. And you can tell that by looking at the cap badges they've got. There's also a lot of other information in that photo as well, such as the good conduct chevrons on their sleeves. You've got the man second from left is wearing a drummer's badge on his sleeve as well. So there's lots of information you can gain from looking at photos. I mentioned earlier the Army of India to 1857. It's worth just focusing on this for a little bit as well. So the Honourable East India Company raised and maintained a large proportion of the European Army for India, including 9 battalions of European infantry, artillery and engineers. But the remainder of the garrison in India came from Britain, and that's from regiments like the Essex Regiment, like the Rifle Brigade, like name any regiment in Britain. And they were styled Queen's Troops. The total army in India numbered 280,000 men. The balance composed of 155 native infantry and 21 native cavalry regiments. But it all changed after the Indian Mutiny. After that, there was to be no local European army and no local artillery. The East India Company's military forces were embodied in those of the Crown, and the whole of the European forces formed part of the Queen's Army. The native force was not to bear a greater proportion to the European than 2 to 1 for Bengal, which was the majority of what had the largest share of the army, and from 3 to 1 in those other 2 presidencies. And as I say, 60% of the army was stationed in Bengal. So after the mutiny, a proclamation went out on the 1st of January announcing direct rule of India by the Queen. She became the Empress of India. Rebels were pardoned unless they'd taken part in massacres. India was then garrisoned by troops of the British Army. And in lieu of the regiments of cavalry and battalions of infantry, including those from the Honourable East India Company, the army sent out 9 regiments of cavalry and 88 batteries of field artillery and horse artillery and garrison artillery, and plus the 53 battalions of infantry. So there was a heavy concentration of troops in India, which is why that establishment rose from the figure we looked at earlier on to close to 73,000 by 1893. And if you look at those men again, look at the hairstyles, their partings in the middle, wonderful, and all set to go out on the town. That photo was taken in Murray and Pindi in 1893. I'm just going to turn the light on. So after the mutiny, more regiments of foot were created. So these prior East India Company, Honourable East India Company regiments now were given titles. So the Royal Bengal Fusiliers became the 101st Foot, and so on and so forth. I won't read through them all, but they were all given titles, the next in line in precedence. And those regiments would later have county titles as well. So what had been the Royal Bengal Fusiliers became the 101st Foot, and from 1881 it became the 1st Royal Munster Fusiliers. And again, Richard Tryman, who I mentioned earlier on, not a happy man. Take the 27th Inniskilling, he said, a regiment essentially Irish in its character and composition, linked to the 108th Madras Infantry. 27th has a glorious history of 2 centuries. The 108th was only raised by the East India Company in 1854 and has no more to do with Ireland than the Russian Guards. So he was still banging on, still incensed about the pairing of regiments that had nothing in common with one another. But in time, those regiments would establish their own glories. The Munster Fusiliers in 1914 and elsewhere, they would all forge new identities, even though their origins were a little unusual, let's say. So there's a lot of records on Findmypast for the British in India. You've got 735,000 births. You've got 500,000 marriages, over 500,000 deaths. And the way to find these is just go to the All Records Set search on Findmypast, and type in India in that search box, and you'll come up with all the Indian record sets. You'll come up with some for Indiana as well, for that matter, but you can ignore those. India will be first, and then you can just select the ones you want to look at. So here's an example. Here's one I did earlier in Best Blue Peter's tradition. That's me typing in India in that search box, and this is how they appear. So again, you've got those figures there, as well as the baptisms, burials and marriages. You've got regimental service record, wills and probate, etc. So we've looked so far at the regular army, and I will be talking in another talk in future about the militia. The militia offered military service to men who were willing to train for a year but didn't want the full-time commitment of soldiering, and it was replaced in 1908 by the Special Reserve and the Extra Reserve. But the object was the same for both. It was to maintain in the United Kingdom a trained body of men who could be called upon to supplement the regular army. And the militia was called upon. It was called upon in the Boer War and fought in the Boer War. And by the time of the First World War, the Special Reserve and the Extra Reserve, those men went out and were part of drafts, filling casualties in the ranks for the regular battalions. So the sovereign may, in such cases, direct by proclamation that the whole or part of the militia should be embodied. And as I say, that did happen. And that's taken from the Army Book for the British Empire. And the militia could also be quite useful for men who found themselves out of work. You had the training regime was for 49 working days, and men did go on strike, and that's all well and good for people calling the strike. But then that put the man out of work, no money coming in. What did he do to survive? And this interesting extract from the Army and Navy Gazette from 1893. Highlights a correlation between men who are going on strike and a rise in men joining the militia. So they're forced onto strike, and rather than sitting idly at home on strike, they join the militia and they get paid for being on the militia. So that would have helped them out. For some men, of course, they didn't necessarily know that the army was going to be the career for them. The militia trained generally at the regimental depot where the regular battalions were based as well, and it was a good introduction to military life. It was far more intense for the militia than it was for the regular soldiers, because they had to fit a lot into 49 working days. But you will often see in the militia records on Findmypast as well, which are in W96. So regular records, regular soldiers, W97, militia in W96. You'll see that men join the militia and then go straight into the regular army as well. And if you're lucky, you'll find a militia record for a man, and you'll find his regular army record as well. And then the volunteer force. So the volunteer force would later become the territorial force, and which would later become the territorial army, which we will all be familiar with. And that was created in 1859. It was autonomous units raised at county level. Members provided their own arms and equipment and defrayed all costs except when assembled for service. And they could even choose their design of their uniform subject to the Lord Lieutenant's approval, Lord Lieutenant of the county, that is, because it was organised on a county level, very much the same as the territorial force as well. So and it was taken up very enthusiastically by people in Britain. And again, if you look to the newspapers, you'll find lots of information about the volunteer force. The Victorians and the Edwardians loved lists of names, so you will often see shooting competitions, rifle competitions for volunteer force units, which is just as well, because there's very few records that survive for volunteers in anywhere. There's certainly very few on Findmypast. Occasionally in a territorial force man's service record from 1908, when the VF volunteer force became the territorial force, and he joined the TF, you might see his earlier volunteer force paper, but it was a very basic paper. It was only 2 sides, and his number, I don't think, it didn't appear on the first side. It appeared on the reverse of that form. But very basic, doesn't give you much information. But nevertheless, as I say, it was a very popular movement. 253,000 volunteers. But nevertheless, under establishment, as most of the army was throughout the Victorian era. So that sort of brings us to the end of my whisk through of the Victorian Army and Victorian soldiering, but I can't leave without giving you some recommended reading. And I've split this up into sections really. So these are really my must-haves, my must-reads. So the Army Book for the British Empire is a terrific book, and I have a copy here, which is I always keep within arm's reach. And to prove it, I'm going to reach around and find it. There it is. You'll be able to see that if you're looking at me and look at the photo. It's a fantastic book, and it's also available on the Internet Archive. So you can go to the Internet Archive and type in Army Book for the British Empire, and you can download it and read it. I still prefer books, so I have got a downloaded copy, but I've also got the book as well. One of the authors of that was J.M. Grierson, who wrote in 1900, I think it was called Our Army, which has subsequently been published as Scarlet into Khaki, and that's a terrific book which gives you a snapshot of the army in at the time of the Boer War. Very detailed. All the minutiae of the army that you would want to know is in that book. And similarly, Navy and Army Illustrated, 1895 to 1902, that magazine was published. I can't rate it highly enough. I'm not as interested in the Navy as I am in the Army, and it was split into the first half would be Navy, the second half would be Army. But you have good articles, great photos. You have a notes and queries section where people are writing in and saying, asking questions. You have all sorts of obscure articles on the Army clothing department, on all sorts, funerals in the British Army. It's a great reference resource. The next four titles there, I won't read them all out, but they're all more recent publications on the British Army, the Victorian Army. I recommend the Marquis of Anglesy's multi-volume history of the British Cavalry, which is full of interesting facts. And in fact, it's the Marquis of Anglesey who quotes from a soldier, a cavalryman. The cavalryman was asked what role the cavalry fulfilled in war, and his response was that the cavalry provided tone to what otherwise would be simply a vulgar brawl. So that's a fantastic quote. Then the next three there, Peter Bailey, researching ancestors in the East India Company and Indian Army, and Ian Baxter. So those three are very much India specific. And then the final three, I've just added those in. Again, small books. These are all Shire books. And if you again look at the camera, there's Military Barracks, Victorian Soldier, and Victoria's Wars. Ian Beckett. This was written when he was a postgraduate, and it's got a very good introduction, a very good summary to the British Army during the reign of Victoria, going through the different wars that the Army was involved in throughout her reign. And then, so that's one set of books. Then on the other, you've got the first-hand accounts, and these are all from my bookshelf. And again, I rate all of them, but some are more useful than others. For frankness, you can't beat Frank Richards. Old Soldiers Never Die and Old Soldier Saab. Frank was a regular soldier, served in India, somehow managed to come through the First World War unscathed, winning the DCM and the MM into the bargain. Served right from 1914 to the end, and came away without a scratch. He obviously had his guardian angel working overtime for him. Edwin Mole, the King's Hussar. If you go to Findmypast and type in Edwin Mole Hussars, you'll find his record on Findmypast. It's in W97. A long-serving soldier. He served a good deal before Frank Richards. And then you've got Horace Walpole, who was what they call a gentleman ranker. So he wasn't from the poorer classes at all when he joined up. He was quite well off, but he joined up as a private, and then he wrote these really good narratives about life in the British Army, which I came across. It wasn't recently. It wasn't recently. It wasn't years ago. It was only probably in the last 5 or 6 years that I came across his narratives. But they're very good, well worth getting. They haven't been. As far as I know, they haven't been reprinted. You might be able to get one or more of those on Internet Archive, but otherwise you can find them online. And then elsewhere, you've got the photograph is Sergeant Pearman. He's the first one on the list here, and you've got the others as well. I mean, screenshot this slide if you want to, but I recommend all of them. They're all very good, and much farther than Kipling, honestly speaking, as well. If you read the Barrack Room Ballads of Rudyard Kipling and read Soldiers 3 as well, I think Kipling got under the skin of the British soldier, and there's a lot of information in his Barrack Room Ballads, if you know what you're looking at, that tells you about life in the army and how the British soldier was treated. So that's that. Thanks for tuning in to that. That's me done. I won't be answering questions at the end of this presentation, but I will go back to any comments that you've put on there. So thank you for tuning in. Hello to those who've said hello to me. I haven't seen your comments, but thank you for joining in. And next month I'll be doing a talk on regimental numbers 1881 to 1920, and you know how you can use numbers to find out more about a man's service. So do tune in for that one, and I look forward to talking to you then. Thank you.